Hi, AP Psychology students, and welcome back. Today we are continuing to talk about the brain, but we're going to focus on researching the brain. So how we learn what we know about the brain, and then also talking a little bit about some famous brain research and what we've been able to learn about the brain and the brain's hemispheres from that research. So this goes with College Board Learning Objective 1.4, which is explaining the structures and the functions of the brain and how that applies to mental and behavior processes. Behavior and mental processes. And the central questions we're going to focus on are: one, how do we study the brain? And then two, how our divided brain specializes for specific functions. So when we are researching the brain, there's really three kind of techniques that we utilize. So the first are brain scans. We're going to talk about that in more detail. We can also use different surgical procedures, or we can look at the brain from past procedures and damage. And then we can also use case studies. And case studies, obviously we talked about this in the science practices unit, but it's just kind of doing a deep dive after the fact, right? After the brain damage or the stroke or the difference has happened, and kind of taking a look at what the brain looks like afterwards and what that might give us, what information that might give us. But remember, of course, with case studies, we're always really careful because it's not really representative of the general population, right? It can give us information, but it won't tell us that everybody or everything always works this way. So when we are researching the brain, one of the things that we focus on are these brain imaging techniques, right, or brain scans. So the first brain scan that you may have heard of is an EEG, and this measures electrical brain activity. And we're going to talk about this a lot more when we talk about sleep and sleep stages and how we know what stage of sleep you're in based on the electricity in your brain. Then we also have CT scans, which are, it's basically instead of a single x-ray, it's like a bunch of x-ray photos taken and then combined to give you a representative slice of the brain. MRIs, they use magnetic fields and radio waves to produce images of the brain's soft tissue. An fMRI, which is they use an MRI technology, but they show where blood flow is. So they lay it on top, they lay the scans on top of each other, and that allows you to see where blood flow is, which gives you information about not just the structure like an MRI, but about the function, right? So what the brain is doing, where brain activity is. And then PET scans. So PET scans reveal brain activity through using figuring out where the brain is utilizing glucose. So you inject this serum, and then basically it allows the brain to light up and utilizes the glucose, and then that tells you where the brain is functioning. So when we think about brain scans, I like to kind of organize them into two sections. So the CT and the MRI, those are for the structure of brain, right? And then we have the fMRI and the PET scan, and those give us more about functioning of the brain. So the next way that we can kind of research or understand, study the brain is through different surgical procedures. And basically the idea here is that we impact the brain in some way and then observe that impact on either the behavior or the functioning. So there's two different ways you can kind of go about this. One is with lesions. So we study how brain tissue damage that occurred either naturally or during surgery or through experimentation, we can put electrodes in the brain that then would lesion the brain or prevent neurons from sending, or stimulation. So we use electrodes again, but in a different way. Instead of preventing the messages from being sent in a particular area, we then stimulate messages to be sent in that area and see what happens to the person, right? Their body, their brain, their behavior, their functioning. Obviously, doing this research can be very unethical, right, if you don't do it with the correct guidelines. And oftentimes we use animal research when lesioning the brain or stimulating the brain. So this is an example of rats. The one rat had a lesion in the ventromedial hypothalamus, and you don't need to know the specific area of the hypothalamus right now, but remember hypothalamus: feeding, fighting, fleeing, making love, right? Those 4 F's. So it had the ventromedial hypothalamus lesioned, and they found out that it kept eating and eating and eating and eating and eating and never felt full and became very obese. And so now we know the ventromedial hypothalamus is the part of your brain that makes you feel full, or feel satiated, feel satisfied. And if that's turned off or lesioned, damaged, then you never feel full, and you keep eating and eating and eating. Okay, so in studying the brain, what we've realized is that the brain has this amazing ability called plasticity, right? And this is its ability to rewire or modify or create new connections throughout your life, right? So as we've researched the brain, we've realized that this is true. And we've kind of found, and there's 2 different examples of how we've realized this. So for example, when we've studied the the brain of patients who have occipital or who have vision loss, right? So for some reason something happens to their eyes, their retina, we're not sure, but they have vision loss. So what we find is that their brain, the occipital lobe that is no longer being utilized by their eyes, starts to light up when they are feeling something so that it can be better utilized for reading Braille during touch, right? So the brain is rewiring itself. Connections that are not being used start to be used in other places. This is also another example of this, is that they studied taxi drivers in London who have to like memorize every single street and take this like crazy hard exam. And what they found is that London taxi drivers who have passed this exam actually have a larger hippocampus. They have hippocampus growth, right, due to those experiences in their life. So when we talk about brain plasticity, there's really two different ways we can look at it. If we talk about the way that the brain kind of reorganizes itself, that's functional neuroplasticity. So things are rewiring or regrowing after some sort of damage or some sort of issue or injury to the brain. Or we can have structural neuroplasty, which is where the brain like changes due to experience. So there's no like damage or anything, but the more learning or experience you do in a particular area, those synapses forms greater connections. Like this is long-term potentiation, and then over time that leads to like different like physical structural differences in the brain. So one of the more famous kind of studies of the brain was dealing with this split brain research. So what they were finding in some people is that people were having major epileptic seizures, and they thought that maybe these epileptic seizures were being made worse because the hemispheres were communicating, and so the electrical energy was like spreading back and forth and kind of like feeding off of each other. So they wanted to try splitting the brain by cutting the corpus callosum. That way the electrical energy couldn't kind of feed off each other, and maybe it would prevent the seizures. What they found is when they split the corpus callosum, the seizures stopped and no major effects were found for the patients long term. So there were some weird things that kept happening in the beginning with the right and the left hand, because remember the hemisphere, because we know that the hemispheres were cut and so they weren't communicating quite properly or at all, but over the long term we didn't see any damage. So we thought like, wow, this is great. So what they did then is they brought these split brain patients into the lab, and they had them do some tasks where they tried to show them particular images or words to only half of the brain, right? Because their brains don't communicate. If I just show them something in their like right eye, it only goes to the left brain. And then the left brain can't tell the right brain like it can in every kind of 99% of the population, right? So they were asked to perform these special tasks. And if you look at this picture, it's a really great description of what happened. So when the word was flashed briefly to the patient's right field of view, right face. So it was the right eye and it went to the left brain. And what we realized is that they could talk. They could say, oh, I see the word face. And we're like, okay, good, that's true. However, when we flash the word to the right or to the left eye, which goes to the right hemisphere, the patient said, I don't see anything. They said, I don't see anything. And we're like, what do you mean you don't see anything? It's right there. But they couldn't. They said, I don't see anything. But then if you ask them to draw what they saw with that hand, with the same eye, so the left hand, they were able to draw the face. This is wild, right? Because they said they didn't see anything. So what we found from this is that the left and the right brain each kind of have these specialized functions. And in you and me, you would never really notice this difference because our brains are constantly communicating. But in a split brain, in a lab where you can kind of send things only to one part of the brain or one side of the brain, you're able to see these differences. And so from studying these differences, we were able to learn some things about the right and the left hemisphere. And if this little diagram really freaks you out or this study seems very overwhelming, we're going to kind of watch a video of this happening live in class. And I promise it'll make more sense after watching it. So what we learned about the brain is this idea called lateralization, so that different functions of each hemisphere exist in the brain. One of the most important things is that the right hemisphere controls the left side of the brain, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the brain, right? Now, very, very careful as we learn about this. Just because the hemispheres have specialized functions doesn't mean you only use half of it or that somebody is right-brained or left-brained. You use both brains for almost every task that you do on a daily basis. So the right hemisphere, we learned through studying, specializes in reading emotions, facial expression, making inferences, identifying self-awareness, completing perceptual tasks like rotating images in space, and controlling the left side of the body. Then the left hemisphere specializes in determining cause and effect, so it always looks for answers to things. It can tell you why something is happening, and it's very well known for its language skills, right? And that's something they discovered in that split brain research, because when it was seen, something was seen by the right eye, the left brain could talk and could say what it was. And it's also kind of known to specialize in solving mathematical problems. Through further study of this left hemisphere, we realized that there are two parts of the brain that are connected specifically with its language skills on the left side. And that is the Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe, and it's known for speech production, so moving the mouth. And then there's Wernicke's area, which is known for speech comprehension, so understanding what someone's saying, and that's on the left side in the temporal lobe. So you've got the Broca's and the Wernicke's that only exist in most people on the left hemisphere, and that allows left to be specialized in those language skills. All right, AP Psychos, make sure you can answer these essential questions. And that's all for now. Remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.